I'm going to introduce now our luncheon speaker, Eileen Pollack. Eileen is a graduate of Yale University. She has a bachelor's in physics and received a Marshall Fellowship to study English and philosophy at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. It's not on? Is it on now? Yes. Oh, well, okay. Eileen Pollack, graduate of Yale, bachelor's in physics, and then somehow lost her way and got her master's in MFA in creative writing from the University of Iowa. She's the author of some terrific short stories and a fiction, The Rabbi in the Attic and Other Stories, novel, Paradise, New York, and a creative nonfiction called Women Walking Ahead in Search of Catherine Weldon and Sitting Bull. I think this is going to be very interesting and a very powerful discussion about why there are no longer so many women, or not have been women, in science. So, Eileen?
And yes, definitely keep eating their delicious desserts that I've already sampled up there. Can everybody hear me? Is this working? When Carla was saying upstairs that she was so glad to have me, I have to say that as much as I'm growing to love Carla, she's totally got that backwards. I'm the one who's honored and thrilled to be here. It's true that she issued one of the first invitations to speak that I received after the article in the Times came out, but I would have, and I didn't accept any of the other offers, but I would have accepted this one whenever it had come because it had the magic words Rosalind Franklin in the title. I would do anything for any group that is honoring Rosalind Franklin. And I'm thrilled to be here when you're honoring Jo Handelsman, who's one of my personal heroes. If she hadn't done her study, which was the study we all knew needed to be done, but that no one had actually done, I wouldn't have gotten my article in the Times. She provided the news peg that persuaded the editors to take the piece. I don't know if the Vilcheks are here or if they'll just be here for dinner, but there's a really lovely symmetry in that. A couple of years ago, I was one of the judges for their literature prize, and all the prizes are given out on the same night, so it was the same night they awarded the science prizes, and it was this wonderful event with writers and all sorts of artists and scientists, and we were all sitting at the same tables, and I felt as if my two halves had come together, and this is another one of these occasions. So I just think the Vilcheks do just wonderful work in this world. But mostly I'm glad to be here because all of you are my heroes. You're the women in science I grew up wanting to be, and I did get sidetracked. So I know it's sometimes not a pure and unalloyed joy to be a woman in science. If your experiment didn't work that day, or you didn't get the grant you worked so hard to apply for, or someone dissed you, and you're sitting there thinking, oh God, why didn't I become a writer or something? Just know that there's a writer who's sitting there wishing she were you, if that helps at all. So I'm only here because I published this article in the Times, and I thought I would give you a little bit of background info on how that came to be, and then the response I got, because I think it was a very interesting response. So for those of you who haven't read it, just very briefly, I grew up in upstate New York back in the dark ages, and I grew up loving both writing and science. But when I got to 7th grade, some of the boys, so there were no AP courses or anything, so their idea was to skip ahead a few kids in science and math so that when they were juniors or seniors, they could take physics and calculus at the community college. So they gave us all a test to see our abilities, but then they only skipped the boys ahead. And one of the boys, who's still a friend to this day, told me, what they said, Eileen, the principal said, you scored very high too, but girls don't go on in science and math, so it would just be wasting a seat. And besides, it would ruin your social life, he said, for a girl to get skipped ahead in science and math. Of course, I had no social life because if you're a girl who's interested in science and math in 7th grade, you don't have one anyway. So I got angry. I also resented that everybody kept patting me on the head and saying, yeah, heads. I felt like I had 2 heads. And kept saying, well, you know, you should just be a writer. That's such a nice thing for a girl to do. So I decided I wanted to be a physicist, and I read a lot of books about space and time. I taught myself calculus from a book. That's why I had that question upstairs about online learning. I somehow got myself into Yale, and then I was completely blown out of the water. I was terribly ill-prepared compared to all the guys, especially the guys who had gone to fancy prep schools and had 2 years of calculus and college-based physics. I was the only girl. I was the first girl to major in physics as an undergrad at Yale, the only woman in any of my classrooms. There were no female faculty, very few even outside the sciences. So, of course, it was miserable. I worked myself sick, both mentally and physically, to try to make up for those deficits and the pressures I felt. And by the end, I have to say, I was pretty much top of my class in terms of my grades, my research experience, fellowships, all sorts of things. But it didn't feel that way inside. I felt as if I were still behind, not good. And really looking back, because no one said, you're good at this, why don't you go on? In fact, in many ways, they were pretty discouraging about me going on to grad school. I didn't. I became a writer instead. I physically locked all the papers from that part of my life in a trunk in the basement and just pretended it had never happened. I was so ashamed that I had, in fact, proved the principle right, that women don't go on in science and math. The only way I reconnected with that side of myself was after Larry Summers asked why there weren't more senior women in physics at his university. Now, some people who read the article thought I was too kind to Larry, but I've known Larry since we were teenagers, from high school debate, if you can believe that. And he actually was the first guy I ever met who seemed to really respect and like and seek out women who were smart and powerful. It was a new experience for me. And so I was mad at him. I was mad at him saying, even intimating it could be innate differences. But I knew, well, anyway, I sat down to write him an email that explained, like, look, Larry, this is why I didn't go on. And it wasn't because I wasn't good at it. And the email grew into a book. I had so much to say. So I went down in the basement and I unlocked that trunk. And the book is part memoir and part, so I'm using my own experience to try to bring alive the less obvious reasons that women, at least in my day, didn't go on in science and math, the psychological and cultural reasons, basically. And so I wrote that part of it as a memoir, and then I thought, well, I have a background as a reporter too. I need to see what has or hasn't changed. I didn't want this to just be a story of the bad old days. So I went back to my elementary school, my junior high, my high school, and then to Yale to see what it was like for women today. And when I was at Yale, which is where I met Joe, but first met a physicist named Meg Urry, it seemed it had changed. So here the head of the department was a woman. There were a couple of women on the faculty, and there were a lot more women in the classrooms. But then I held, there was a tea that someone had arranged so that I could talk to the 2 or 3 women that I thought would be interested in gender issues in science. And even the woman who had arranged the meeting said, you know, nobody's really going to show up. And then 90 young women showed up. And their stories were worse than what I had gone through. So it was astonishing, really. So then I knew I had a book. And I followed up. I just tried to see really why hadn't I gone on and what had or hadn't changed. And so I used my own experience to try to contextualize these large. And then I started being interested in the studies and the work that had been done by people more versed in this than I was. And then I couldn't get the book published. Okay, which shouldn't have been a surprise to me because I had already written a novel about a woman geneticist. My ex-husband had worked on the Huntington's gene, and so I was very interested in sort of Nancy Wexler's role in all this. And I couldn't get that, I still to this day have not gotten that novel published because, and these were mostly women editors who said this at trade houses, women's book groups don't want to read about science, and men don't read fiction. And men don't want to read about women scientists, okay? So with this new book, same thing, women in science, small audience, nobody's going to be interested. Partly, what is this hybrid form of a memoir that's also about an issue larger than the self? But so my agent said, well, Eileen, the only way this is going to get published is if you could get an excerpt from it published in a major American magazine, which is sort of like the Wizard of Oz saying, well, you can get back to Kansas I'll get you back if you get the witch's broomstick first. I mean, it's harder almost to, but I had not an in, but I knew somebody who was an editor at the Times Sunday magazine section. Now, he was great. He was really interested in this, partly because the Times, like many publications, have been getting some flack about not publishing enough women or women's issues. But his senior editors were skeptical. So they accepted the piece and then kept me waiting 9 months to publish it. Joe can attest to, oh, it's coming out this weekend. No, they bumped it again. And then it was supposed to be the cover story, and it got bumped by Harry Potter at the last minute. So when it finally came out, I didn't expect much of a response because they had convinced me nobody was going to be interested. And within minutes, it was the most emailed article for the Times, and for an entire week. They shut off the comment section at 1,000, but the comments were still coming in, and I got another 1,000 comments in my email inbox, each of which I somehow felt the obligation to respond to. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about the response I received because I thought it was very interesting. So I did hear from quite a few men, and very few of them were trolls. A troll is a generic term for somebody who's just out to be mean to you. They were really pretty moving, most of them. These men who said, I never realized what my grandmother or my mother really must have gone through to get that degree when she did. Men who suddenly really appreciated what their wives and sisters had gone through, and mostly men who were really upset that their daughters might still go through this. So very interesting responses. Of course, there also were the much less positive responses from the male readers. The most common of which was, so one of my points in my article was that judging on my own experience and the women I had talked to, I thought that one of the major reasons women were still not going on was this, women need more encouragement. To do anything really, but especially to go on in science and math. They don't have the confidence, even the ones who have the talent, even the ones who have done well in a classroom don't know that they're doing well. And unless someone says, you are good at this, you should go on and do this with your life, they think they must be terrible at it, and they don't go on. It was true in my case. I wasn't sure it was true for everybody because I don't do studies. I just sort of work at this more anecdotal level. So many men responded, if you need and then I went back and talked to my former professors from when I was an undergraduate. And I said, why didn't you encourage me to go on? And they said, well, we don't encourage anybody to go on, male or female. If you need encouragement to go on in science, you're not going to be a good scientist. You'll never make it. You need that passion. You need to. And this is what I heard from most male readers who objected to my article on the grounds that male or female, if you need encouragement, you should not be a scientist. It's, to me, I don't know why science thinks that if you need some encouragement to get into it, you're not going to be good at it. It's not true of other fields, right? If you're a musician, you need somebody to say, you know, you're not just an average piano player. You're really good at this. You should consider a career as a musician, right? That doesn't, if you need that little boost at the beginning, right? So maybe you shouldn't have to hear every day in your marriage, I love you, sweetie. But if you're thinking of marrying the guy, it's kind of nice to hear once or twice, I love you, right? We should do this. What the men don't realize, I think, is that to say we don't encourage anybody, male or female, is ludicrous, because the men are getting encouragement every step of the way. Just by seeing that all the scientists in their textbook are male, or seeing men as scientists, or being encouraged to think of themselves as, you will have a career regardless, right? You're not going to stay home and raise the kids. There's so many ways in which the society encourages men. So I thought that was interesting, that so many people seem to think that in science, if you need to hear you're good at this a few times at the beginning, that you're just not cut out for it ever. I also heard, of course, over and over, well, this whole article is ridiculous because women just don't want to be scientists, and women want to be in people fields, right? We only like little fuzzy, cute things to work with. And if there's not a cute, fuzzy thing or another person, we somehow... Now, that would make it seem as if scientists don't ever work with other scientists, right, in labs. I mean, even if you do theoretical physics and you're sitting in your room alone a lot of the time, you're still usually in a department, in a university. There are people around, right? Now, as a writer, I never see people, right? I really sit in a little room by myself. And, I thought about it. Musicians, are they working with people, right? Does anybody say to a woman, don't be a musician because you're just going to work with a violin and notes on a page, right? So, and I thought of all the times as a kid when I had finally decided I wanted to be a physicist. I remember my social studies teacher saying, Pollack, that's crazy. You want to work with people, right? So we're told we want to work with people. Some people do. Some men want to work with people. Or with little cute fuzzy things. But also even biologists, right? How many of you actually work with cute little fuzzy things, or with test tubes and spectrometers and gels, right? There are people in the lab, but that would be true. That's true if you're a chemist too, right? Once you're working with little molecules, right? How different are they from little atoms, or from thinking about space and time? I don't buy that that's as big a reason as people seem to think. It's related to the other comment that I got that blew my mind. Well, it said, Ms. Pollack became a writer, and she's really successful at it, so she must have been meant to be a writer, not a scientist. And I was like, no, I wanted to be a physicist. You guys made it too hard for me, so I became a writer, and now you're using that to say I was meant to be a writer from the beginning. It's as if, women can't go in that room, right? And now the fact that you're allowed here proves you don't want to be in that room and you really prefer to be in here. It was just also mind-boggling. But the best responses of all were from the scientists, male, and I have to say a few women, who disagreed with the idea that Joe's study proves actual bias against women. So you all know that the study was, right, identical resume, job applications, letters, everything the same. It just, one says John, one says Jennifer, and of course John gets hired more, gets mentored more, gets a higher salary, just on the basis of it saying John versus Jennifer. So here are these scientists who see themselves as very rational people writing to me and saying that doesn't prove bias, because what's probably happening is the people doing the hiring are basing their decision to hire John on experience. They know from experience that men are better scientists. They're more productive. They don't have, drop out to have babies. They work harder. They publish more. And so it's based on experience, not bias, right? And even I, who didn't go on and, I have no, I asked Joe to make sure, am I crazy, or is that the definition of bias? Thinking that your 3 experiences with women at some point, right? As far as I know, there is no study that proves that women are worse scientists than men. So it's by definition bias. And as Joe said, if you substitute the name of a racial group in there, and you say, well, I just know by experience that black people aren't as smart or work as hard, right? It's just ludicrous. It's just clearly biased. But you can make that statement about women, and you're clearly judging by, anecdotal experience. You're conflating the whole group, behavior with, what does that have to do with the one person, poor Jennifer, who's applying to you just as Jennifer? So that was mind-boggling. I have to say, though, I was not as surprised by some of the men's responses as the responses I got from women. So again, I got about 1,000, and I went through the 1,000 comments on the Times website. For those of you who wondered, it really is as bad for some young women today as it was for some of us. So one letter, here's one of my favorites. In 2000, I had a professor in an electronics class teach the mnemonic device, quote, "Bad boys rape our young girls, but Violet gives willingly," to help the class remember electronic color coding. When I told him that was offensive, which I have to say is the one difference because I think in my time nobody would have even spoken up, he said it was up to me to make up a new one because that was the one he taught. And yes, I was the only girl in the class. Okay, that was the year 2000. Many of my undergraduates think that's ancient history. So I'll give you a quote from a letter I got from a girl who is currently a student in a fancy private school in Connecticut, where she says it's very competitive and all lip service is paid to, of course, all the girls are going to go on to Ivy League schools. All of the girls in these classes always feel like the dumb ones, she says, referring to her STEM classes. We are afraid to ask questions and be judged by our male peers, and we have all considered dropping down in order to feel like equals in the classroom. I also am very much into clothing design and therefore dress like a normal girl. I am judged even more for this, as not only am I a female in these classes, but I am a female that does not just throw on a t-shirt and glasses every day. Every time I am faced with a difficult task in one of these classes, I find myself doubting my abilities as a scientist and mathematician. I constantly compare myself to the males in the room, how they seem so much more confident with the material. This causes a feeling of helplessness as I question if I could ever live up to what they will accomplish. So that's from someone who is currently a student in high school in a private school in Connecticut. I think the biggest reinforcement I got from the article was that it is encouragement and confidence that seems to be really the biggest stumbling block for the most women. They need to hear more than men, yes, you were good at this, you should go on. Because even if they're getting 100 on their, chemistry exam, on their calculus exam, they somehow, just the way girls are socialized, think that somebody else is getting 105, or everybody's getting 100, or they're really not good because they have to study to get the 100, or they had to they had to ask the teacher a question or something. They'll find whatever in their minds to disqualify themselves. And so many women said, I looked back on why I dropped out, why I didn't go on, and I realized now I was good enough. I just didn't hear it. I didn't think it. What was lovely was the sense that it takes so little to change that women just read my article, and not to give myself credit, but really just to show how little it takes. One woman wrote and said, I can't believe it. I'm, college educated, I'm a feminist, but my daughter is struggling with calculus, and she wanted to drop out. Oddly enough, my husband is the one who's making her take it. I was screaming at him, this is too hard for her. Why are you making her do this? And I wanted her to drop it. And then I read your article and I said, oh my God, what am I doing? My daughter is not dropping that class. She is going to stay in that class, So it doesn't take much once you're aware of this to know what's going on and to change it. I also heard from so many women who felt that if they made it to graduate school, it was the isolation, the competitiveness, but also the pressure to lead a sort of one-dimensional life, an unhealthy life, and that whoever was running the lab, sometimes male or female, was reinforcing the idea that this is the only way to be a scientist. If you're not in the lab 24/7, putting it above all else, including your children, your, whether you like to dance or to play tennis or whatever, you're not a real scientist and you're not going to get my approval, you're not going to go on. And that this notion that we somehow, not to take this to mean that we should make women as able to lead unhealthy unidimensional lives as the men, but that we should maybe look into changing the culture in grad school or in our labs to make it more livable for men and women. And to take as our model maybe medical school, where for decades, centuries, the idea was it has to be a living hell. If you can't get through the living hell of your residency and internship, you're not fit to be a doctor. And if that means you don't have a wife at home taking care of everything for you, that's your problem. And then that culture changed because men sort of saw that maybe they wanted to have more livable lives as doctors, and those changes were made. The other, of course, I heard so much from women who had made it to actually have careers in science, that continual wearing down of feeling disrespected, of not getting as much funding as not, but all this elusive, you can't quite put your finger on it sort of stuff, and how tiring that gets over the long haul. That I don't have to tell you about. And women still feeling that they would need to be so much more aggressive than they actually want to be, or that it still made them feel unfeminine or undateable to even say that they wanted to go on in science and math. That really hasn't changed, and in some ways has gotten worse since most of us were young. So I grew up in the 60s and 70s, where there was at least this idea that women weren't going to make such a big deal about getting their hair done and wearing fancy clothing and walking around in stilettos. So it didn't matter to me so much that I felt I had to wear jeans and a sweatshirt to be taken seriously in my physics class. But young women today have very different cultural pressures on them, and they really, as we heard from that young woman in high school, they want to dress in more conventionally feminine ways, and it's even harder now to do that. And there's still this enormous pressure on them to be married, to be engaged by the time they're out of college, and have these fancy weddings and these kind of Martha Stewart, be super mothers. And so that culture, I think, is even worse for them than it might have been for us when we were coming up. I'll just say a few words about the less obvious responses that I got. The biggest disagreement I got from women with my article was that they felt that the women scientists I quoted, who were trying to be very encouraging, I think, about the possibilities of raising a family while having a high-powered career in science, were saying, well, it's so flexible to be an academic, and if you find a husband who really values your equality and is also a scientist, you can really do this. And so many women wrote and said, no, that's not the case. First of all, it's very hard to find those guys who do more than pay lip service to equality, who will really move with you, who are scientists. It's very hard to get a job in the same, if you do find that person, it's very hard to get a job in the same town, in the same city, that a lot of the, we'll hire a couple, ethos of universities really doesn't translate into hiring both partners, and that it is actually still very hard to manage daycare, to go back into the lab at night. That if you're a lawyer or a doctor, your lawyer can bring your work home with you after the kids are asleep. You can do it in your office. If you're a scientist, you can't bring your experiment home with you. So there was a huge disagreement on that, the sense that, that's somehow easy now. It didn't seem to be. And I have to say that a lot of women wrote and said that they were disappointed in the senior women that they looked up to, who they felt didn't make their lives easier. And I thought, I look at myself even as someone who mentors young writers, young female writers, because a lot of this is the same in literature and writing. Because I noticed that there are many more female grad students in my my creative writing program than men, and there was the men who were going on and publishing books. So I've thought about this, but a lot of it is I compare them now at 20 or 23 or 25 to me now at 50, whatever I am, rather than who I was at their age, right, to who they are at their age. I didn't have any confidence. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I wouldn't admit how much actual discrimination was going on. I just was, my goals were so different. So the things that make me impatient about them would have made me, if I was talking to my own self at their age, and yet I'm harsh on them in certain ways, because I think I'm so appalled at what I let happen to me when I was their age, and instead of encouraging them and trying to keep them from doing the same thing, I'm almost angry at them, which I think some of them might pick up on. I think also, so in my article I talked about the women, they called themselves, you'll pardon my French, the women who don't give a crap, and that's what it takes to really succeed. But I think there's a feeling among those of us who have succeeded that, yeah, we're the women who don't give a whatever. But are those the only women we want to see go on in our fields, right? Do you really still need to be Superwoman to go on? When we will know we have succeeded when women who are not Superwomen, women who do care about how they're perceived and what they wear and all that they go on to, that we don't expect young women to just be really tough and not care about anything to succeed, that's setting the bar too high, because that's not a bar that men have to face in the field. And if sometimes we're shocked by how they dress, or the fact that they really do want the fancy wedding, or they're spending, they seem to care more about cooking than maybe we did, to just realize the culture is very different from them. And we may counsel them that, if you pursue this standard of motherhood, you will A, fail at it, and B, never have time to do another thing in your life. But to be angry at them. So one quote that I would I'm getting near the end, but there's one that springs to mind. One woman said, "My supervisor, who's female, said to me, if I seem angry at you, it's not that I don't like you, I don't like how you dress. No one will respect you or us if you dress that way." Now, I don't care how, and then the quote, she said, really, my skirts aren't that short. I'm not walking around with anything hanging out that shouldn't be, you know what I mean? So I just would say that sometimes we maybe think they have it better than we do, or we're angry at how we acted or how we were treated at that age, or we're not thinking so much about what they're still going through in their attempt to become us or to become all of you. So anyway, I don't know if we'll have time for questions. I hope so. I just want to say thanks again for inviting me, because I haven't yet sold the book that the article was part of. It may, if all goes well, happen in January, but in the meantime, it's just wonderful to receive your support. You're the people, you're the readers who really count. So thanks. Do we have time for questions? Couple questions, anybody? Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to tell you that the minute I read your article, I loved it, and I was about to speak at the University of Pennsylvania to a seminar of freshmen, men and women, on women in science. And so I rewrote my talk to include that as a central point. And I think you'll be happy to know that these freshmen at the University of Pennsylvania who are going to be majoring in chemistry and engineering and all sorts of things, and some in non-science fields, were they were just, they were kind of really surprised that there was any problem at all. And that was the first time I had heard that, because usually I talk to graduate students who are having more of the experience that you're
Right.
talking about. And so it was very gratifying. So maybe there's still hope, but also
Right.
I really commend that professor, Jeff Winkler at University of Penn, for having a course where he really puts these things right out there.
Right.
And he asked me to speak about women in science, but your article came out right before I went there, so it was.
That
it was
makes
really
me
cool.
feel great. I have to say, I think, when I was an undergrad, I was in total denial of what the realities were that I was facing, and they were so much clearer for me. I think a lot of girls are just sheltered from it, and, they think it won't apply to them. They're not going to get 80 cents on the dollar, right? That's somebody else. I thought it, after the article came out and I was thinking about Joe's study, I had never looked at the salaries in my own department. I was getting 25% less than the guy hired the exact same day I was doing the same job. So I'm even still in denial about it, So, yeah, thanks. Anybody else? Alice.
When your article came out, I was galvanized by it. And I should have written you, but I didn't. But right afterwards, Meg Urey came to Caltech, and she gave a science talk, and then she said that she was willing to meet with any women undergraduate who wanted to meet with her. And it turned out that, they had expected maybe a handful. Well, we filled a whole area. I had to pull several tables together. And there were some young guys there, and I thought, how wonderful to have this as a central theme.
Yeah, thanks. Meg's been just instrumental in so much. She's been so supportive of this. Thank you. Anybody else?
I think thank you very much.
Thanks
That
for
was
having me.
terrific.